Hi there. Today I want to go over how I do my modified garter tab cast on. If you're not sure what a garter tab cast on is, this is just a small example, but what you typically do is cast on a small number of stitches, you knit back and forth creating a garter strip, and then at some point the pattern will tell you to knit across the stitches, rotate your work 90 degrees, pick up stitches along the edge, rotate another 90 degrees, and pick up stitches along the original cast on. Now, for me, by the time you get to the original cast on stitches, things are pretty tight. It's really difficult to know where you're actually picking up stitches, and it just becomes really fussy. So what I've done is come up with a way that picking up these last few stitches becomes much easier. And the way that I do that is by using Judy's Magic Cast On. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove this little sample, and we're going to get started on how I do my garter tab using the Judy's Magic Cast On. If you are unfamiliar with Judy's Magic Cast On, I would suggest that you search on YouTube or just online for a tutorial that goes over the details of Judy's Magic Cast On, and try that out a few times before you get started with this tutorial. I do go over each of the different steps of Judy's Magic Cast On, but we go pretty quickly and I don't go into super detail on how to do it. Also for this tutorial, I'm going to be using rather large needles and chunky weight yarn. And the reason for that is that it's just easier to see when things are a little bit bigger. It translates better, and I think it's easier for you to see. But I would encourage you to also use chunkier yarn and bigger needles if you've never done this before, because it's just so much easier to see things when they're a little bit bigger than working with smaller needles and, say, fingering weight yarn. So for this tutorial, I'm using US size 15 10mm needles and just a chunky yarn. It can be really anything that you have lying around. Okay, so to get started, what we want to do is take the tail end of our yarn, and very much like the long tail cast on, we are going to take the yarn over our thumb and index finger. The big difference between a long tail cast on and Judy's Magic Cast On is that instead of with a long tail cast on going over the index finger and down across the thumb, we're going to go the other way. You just want to make sure that the tail goes up over your thumb and across and down your index finger. And we do this because we have to do it that way in order for the stitches to be oriented on our needles correctly when we're done. You can do it the other way. It just might be a little bit fiddly by the time you get to knitting across the first few stitches. So here we are. I'm just going to pull up a length, and then very much like the long tail cast on, you're going to take your working yarn and your tail yarn and you're just going to grab those with your fingers, creating a slingshot. The other difference between a long tail cast on and Judy's Magic Cast On is that with a long tail cast on, you're only using one needle. With Judy's Magic Cast On, we're actually going to utilize both needles on our circular needle. So to get started, we just want to have our needles resting next to each other. They don't have to be super far apart. You don't have to have a death grip on it. You just kind of want them resting next to each other so that way it's easy for you to manipulate the yarn between the two needles. So for our first stitch, what we want to do is take the yarn that is going between our thumb and our index finger and insert it between our two stitches. Now throughout this tutorial, I'm going to be referring as this top needle as the top needle and this other needle as the bottom needle. I know, shocking. So the first thing that we want to do to get a stitch on our top needle is to place the yarn between the needles, rotate down towards our table, and then bring the needles back up. And that just causes the yarn to twist around that top needle. Okay, so now we're going to get started with our first actual stitch using Judy's Magic Cast On. So we want to put a stitch on our bottom needle. So we're going to rotate towards our index finger, take this string of, or this piece of yarn, loop it over the bottom needle, but between our needles, and pull that down. And you can see that that's created the first stitch. And now we want to put a stitch on our top needle. So we're going to rotate towards our thumb, and we're going to put the thumb yarn between our needles, up over our top needle, and then come back to our starting position. Okay, so you just repeat those two steps the number of times that you need for the stitches that you need to cast on. So we're going to go back towards our index finger, loop over the bottom needle, between the two needles, and then come back to our starting position. For the top needle again, we're going to take our thumb yarn between, over the top, and back to start. And then a stitch on our bottom needle, top, bottom, top, and bottom. So you can see that as you get comfortable with this, the cast on goes pretty quickly. The important thing when you're done is to just make sure that you have the same number of stitches on each needle. So here I have 2, 4, 5 stitches and 2, 4, 5 stitches. Okay, this is actually more stitches than I'm going to need for my garter tab, but just wanted to show you. If you want to practice that cast on a few times, feel free to stop the video here, rewind it, watch it a few times, try it, and then come back to this point when you're comfortable and ready to work on part 2 of the cast on. For the next part, I'm actually just going to pull this off the needles and get back into our starting position, so that way I can cast on the total number of stitches that I'll need for the garter tab. Now for this garter tab, we're going to be casting on 6 stitches, so that will be 3 stitches per needle. Okay, so again, we're going to get into starting position. We're going to loop on that first stitch, and then we're going to cast on 1 stitch to our bottom needle, 2 stitches, and finally our 3 stitches per needle. Okay, now what we're going to do is, with the working yarn over to our left, we're going to take our needles and we're going to just rotate them so that they're pointing to the right, and then we're going to get into position for how we would normally knit. Now, I knit continental, you may knit English style. So if you're throwing the yarn, you can just hold it in your right hand like you would normally. But for this tutorial, I'm going to use continental because that's what I'm most comfortable with. So the first thing that you want to do, because this first stitch isn't really locked into place yet, we're going to take the tail and put it behind. So we're going to go up and over and then behind our working yarn. And you can see that that creates a little bit of a knot, and it locks that first stitch into place so that way it doesn't slide off and go anywhere. So we're just going to put our tail over here and we're going to just ignore it for right now. And then what we want to do is pull out our bottom needle. So when we do that, you're going to see that the 3 stitches that were on our needle are now resting on the cable. And for right now, we're just going to ignore these 3 stitches that are on our cable needle. And we're just going to work across the 3 stitches that are on our left needle. Okay? So getting into just our normal knitting position, we're going to knit straight across these 3 stitches. So there's 1, 2, and 3. And then we're going to turn our work. Okay. Again, just ignoring those 3 stitches that are on the cable needle, just leave them hang out there. And we're going to knit back across the 3 stitches on our left needle. Okay. And depending on the pattern and the number of stitches that, or the number of garter rows that you need to do, you'll just continue to do that until you're ready to start picking up the stitches. For this tutorial, we're done. So what we want to do is now take the cable and start pulling it back through our stitches. And what that's going to do is pull our needle that's not doing anything right now back into those stitches. And as you move the stitches from the cable back onto the needle, it might be a little tight, but just kind of twist the needle a little bit and eventually it will slide right back into those 3 stitches. Okay, so we're gonna get the tail kind of out of our way. And what you should have is 3 stitches on your right needle, the working yarn coming away from your right needle, 1 garter bump in between your needles, and then 3 stitches on your left needle. So for the garter tab, what we want to do is pick up 1 stitch from the side of our work at the top of that garter bump. And really, when you're picking up stitches on the side of your work, you can really pick it up anywhere at the top of that garter bump. You just want to make sure that you're on the edge. And then we're just going to pick up 1 stitch. Okay, so now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches on our right needle. And then what we want to do is just knit across the 3 stitches on our left needle, just like we normally would. Okay, and when we're done, what we're left with is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stitches on our right needle and no stitches on our left needle or the cable. This gets us in a position to start working the rest of the pattern. If you would like to see a pattern that uses this technique, check out my Nightwing shawl, which is available on Ravelry. It uses my modified garter tab cast on with this exact number of stitches for the cast on. And then when you're ready to work the next row, you just turn your work and knit as normal. So you would just knit straight across these stitches. I hope this tutorial helps you understand how to do the modified garter tab cast on, and I hope that you find it much easier to do instead of having to try and pick up the original cast on stitches.